Hey everyone, and welcome. So today we're going to dive into something called Avoidant/Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, or ARFID for short. Now, this is a big one because it's a diagnosis that gets so easily confused with something we all think we know, picky eating. Let's really get into what separates the clinical diagnosis from just, common fussiness.
Right off the bat, this is the question on everybody's mind. Is ARFID just a new, fancy clinical label for being a picky eater? I mean, we all know someone who was super picky as a kid, right? Maybe it was even you. But what we're talking about here is truly in a different ballpark. So what is it, officially? Well, ARFID is a serious clinical diagnosis. We're talking about a persistent disturbance in eating that actually leads to a failure to meet basic nutritional needs. And what's really interesting is that even though these behaviors aren't new, the diagnosis itself is. It only just showed up in the official diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, pretty recently.
You can kind of see the journey this diagnosis has been on right here. It went from just a common phrase like picky eating, through some older clinical terms, and finally landed under this one big umbrella, ARFID. And because it pulled so many different presentations together, it's actually created some real challenges in how it's defined. This quote, wow, it really gets to the heart of the problem. One of our sources pointed out that the official criteria are so broad, a clinician could technically stretch the label to fit almost anyone. And that just shows you the challenge we're dealing with, a definition that can feel a little, well, vague. So, how do clinicians actually make a call? Well, they're looking for at least one of these four major signs. We're talking about significant weight loss, or in kids, a failure to grow, or maybe serious nutritional deficiencies showing up in blood work. Sometimes it's a dependence on supplements or even tube feeding just to stay healthy. And other times it's that the person's eating habits are just wreaking havoc on their social life. The bottom line is, it has to have a real, measurable, negative impact. And it's so important to be clear about what ARFID is not. This is the big one. Unlike anorexia, ARFID is not driven by fears about body weight, shape, or body image. It's not. It's also not because someone doesn't have enough food available, and it's not part of a specific cultural practice. At its core, it's a constant failure to fuel your body properly. And you know what? It almost never travels alone. And that leads us to this, just a staggering number. In up to 72% of ARFID cases, there's another condition right there alongside it. We're talking anxiety disorders, OCD, autism spectrum disorder. They're incredibly common. This tells us that these co-occurring conditions aren't just a side note, they're pretty much the norm, and they're a huge piece of the puzzle. Okay, so if it's not just one thing, what does ARFID actually look like in the real world? It's definitely not a monolith. The research points to three main ways it shows up, three primary faces of ARFID. And figuring out which one you're dealing with is absolutely crucial for getting the right help. First up, we have what's called the fear of aversive consequences subtype. This one is all about anxiety. Just imagine someone who choked on food once or saw someone else throw up, and now they are just terrified that it's going to happen to them every time they eat. It often comes on really suddenly after a bad experience. Really, it's like an anxiety disorder that has picked food and eating as its target. Then you've got the second subtype, which is all about sensory sensitivity. For these folks, it's the texture, the smell, sometimes even just the look of a food that is completely overwhelming. It's not them being difficult. Their brain is literally processing that food as a threat. It's genuinely distressing. And what's interesting here is that this type is much more commonly seen in people who also have autism.
And the third subtype is maybe the most fascinating, a simple lack of interest. These are the people who say, I just forget to eat. And they're being 100% serious. They just don't get those normal hunger cues that tell the rest of us it's time for a meal. And because it's a chronic, long-term thing, it often ends up leading to more significant weight loss over time.
So let's just lay it all out side by side. You can see the main driver for each type: fear, sensory overload, or just no hunger cues. And you can see how that affects when it starts and whether weight loss is a major issue. It makes it crystal clear why a one-size-fits-all treatment plan is just destined to fail. Which brings us to the most important part of this whole conversation. What do we do about it? How do you treat ARFID? The absolute key, the magic word, is individualization. You cannot throw a generic plan at this. You have to zero in on the specific challenge that person is actually facing. And here's what that looks like. If the problem is fear, you treat it like you would any other anxiety disorder, using things like cognitive behavioral therapy.
If it's about sensory issues, you call in an occupational therapist or a dietitian who gets it. And for that lack of interest type, the focus becomes mechanical eating, eating on a schedule, not based on hunger, and sometimes even exploring medications to help kickstart their appetite. It's all about matching the tool to the job.
So what kind of therapies are we talking about? Well, here are some of the evidence-based approaches that are really gaining steam. And notice a theme here. So many of them, like family-based treatment and space, aren't just about the person with ARFID. They are heavily focused on empowering the parents, the whole family, to become part of the solution. That's huge, especially with kids and teens.
All right, as we start to bring this all together, let's get real about what the path forward actually looks like. It is so important to set realistic expectations here. The road to recovery takes an incredible amount of patience and persistence from literally everyone involved. This quote right here might be the single most important thing for families to hear. The goal of treatment is not to take someone with ARFID and transform them into a foodie who's excited to try the new fusion restaurant every Friday night. That's just not a realistic or a compassionate goal. The real goals are way more practical. Step 1, and this is non-negotiable, make sure the person is getting enough nutrition to be healthy, period. From there, the goal is to build up a small handful of reliable, safe foods that let them function, so they can go to a friend's house or a birthday party without a crisis. It's always about function and health first, way before variety. So if you're out there supporting someone with ARFID, please remember this. Progress happens in tiny, baby steps, not giant leaps. And this is critical. Never restrict their access to the few foods they feel safe with. That will only make things worse. And above all, this can't feel like a punishment. Even if the person themselves isn't ready for therapy, the family can still start the work. The support system can start making changes. So I'll just leave you with this to chew on. Now that we know ARFID isn't just picky eating, but this really complex condition with these very distinct faces, how does that change the way we think about food and health and the struggles people have with eating? It's a pretty big question and definitely one we're thinking about. Thanks so much for tuning in.